Hello, welcome to the next lecture in our series on early Mahayana and Prajnaparamita. I want to just remind you of something which we talked about already, and that is that the idea of using words like Buddhism, Mahayana, as if their meaning is in concrete, and you know exactly what you mean when you say it, is that the truth is these words can only have meaning when we identify what aspect of them we're talking about. Far too often, and I have told you I'm guilty of this too, we use the word Buddhism as if it's a meaningful word. But unless I somehow tell you what aspect of Buddhism I'm speaking about, it's almost a meaningless word. And that's true for Mahayana, and I want to talk about that from this Mahayana from this point of view. If we understand Mahayana, it's very important that we identify place, time, source. So let's look at all the forms, or at least a few of the many forms that Mahayana has taken through the years. In India, as we discussed already, India is a huge place. It's a whole subcontinent. It was a very complex cultural, linguistic, social area. It's bounded by water mainly, and as you can see from this map, by a wall of mountains to the north that both protected it, allowed it to have its own cultural patterns, maintained its ability to survive, if you will. And when we talk about Mahayana in India, we're talking about a huge area that you're seeing here. So in an earlier lecture, we talked about Professor Bunkhorst identifying the origins of Mahayana as he felt it up in the Northwest. But we look at other studies of Mahayana, and we find them on the east coast of India. And so I'll remind you that what I've suggested is that these two areas were connected through a series of sailing circuits, and that Mahayana was, from one point of view, the Mahayana of this system that included the maritime tradition around the coastline of India. So even the origin of Mahayana may be multiple, may be part of a widespread systemic development. It is certainly difficult to determine exactly what aspect of it is the earliest seeds of it. Probably none of that can be ever really truly captured. However, in India itself, The biggest issue, I think, is that on the East Coast, Nagarjuna was one of the teachers who made Mahayana, I think, into a philosophic tradition. As I said to you, I identify Mahayana as the introduction of texts. When you have a text, that's when you have, basically when you have Mahayana, or at least the Mahayana which we can study. The Mahayana which has some way to date it, to locate it. And Nagarjuna was already by perhaps the 2nd century of the Common Era, making use of a textual tradition and a philosophical and analytic one, in which he took the teachings of Prajnaparamita and reduced them, if you will, to a type of logical and philosophical reasoning in order to better explain them and deal with them. So Nagarjuna is a great force. So we can say we have Mahayana up in the Northwest, as identified by Bronkhorst. We have Mahayana on the East Coast, as identified by Nagarjuna. Which one is the real Mahayana? Well, both. That's why it's really important for us when we say Mahayana to say what we mean by it. Do we mean the Mahayana of Nagarjuna? Or do we mean the Mahayana of the area up in the Northwest, strongly influenced by the Sarvastivada tradition, dealing with the emptiness of all mental states? Now we have an interesting early development in the Red River Valley of Vietnam, of all places, where a yogic master, Kang Sung Hui, in the 3rd century, began to teach the meditations and a tradition which many people today identify as similar to the Chinese Chan tradition. The big question is what he taught Mahayana? If so, then we would have to say the Mahayana, as expressed by this yogic meditation master in the 3rd century in a port just south of China. It's possible. I don't deny it. It still needs to be studied from that point of view. I do not believe that we can say that this is the Chan tradition that later developed based on the work of the great masters who came from China at a later time, like Bodhidharma. But it is an indication that there were these Chan masters or these Zen, these meditation masters, these great yogins who were perhaps forerunners of Buddhist practice. And they could travel and brought with them their method of meditations. And those were highly developed forms of meditation. Do we count them as Mahayana? Back in India in the 4th century, Mahayana developed. We have a wonderful story of a Sangha and his brother, Vasubandhu. And the story is that Vasubandhu and Asanga were on opposite sides of the Buddhist tradition. One teaching early Buddhist, so-called, quote, Hinayana, and the other teaching a Mahayana form. And so the two of them came into conflict with each other. So from that perspective, we look at the texts which were done by these two brothers. Vasubandhu did, of course, the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, one of the most famous of the Buddhist doctrinal texts. And Asanga brought in a whole new tradition, the Yogacara Bhumi, which is yoga, meditation, the practice of meditation, and the text which developed to explain it, as well as the Mahayana Samgraha. The lore says Sangha wrote these texts in order to help convert his brother, because he was afraid his brother would never reach enlightenment because he had been trapped in the Abhidharma. So we have, again, a Mahayana of a Sangha. And that's the kind of identification that I wish to put forward with regard to Mahayana in all of its aspects. If we go back to the northwest of India and to the trade routes and the caravan routes that went to China, then the great carrier of Mahayana tradition was Kumarajiva. And Kumarajiva, as many of you already know, Kumarajiva was a Sarvastivadin who came in contact with Prajnaparamita texts and was converted and became a Mahayanist, or so it said. So Kumarajiva came to China in the 4th century, late 4th, and began to tell the Chinese about the difference between the lesser, earlier teaching of Buddhism and the more developed teaching, as he saw it, of the Prajnaparamita and the Mahayana. So we can say at the Chinese capital of Chang'an, we find Kumarajiva's Mahayana. And again, we have identified Mahayana with a place, with a person, with a date. But Kumarajiva didn't have it all his way. There was another monk who came at the same time to the capital in Chang'an, Buddhabhadra. And Buddhabhadra was, like Kangsen Hui in the Red River Valley, considered to be a meditation master, a yogin. When he got to the capital, and here was this very popular Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was beloved by the royal house. He was a great translator, and he was someone who was telling the Chinese how to meditate. Buddhabhadra came along and said, you can't just practice what he's saying about meditation. Kumarajiva really doesn't have a lineage. I, by contrast, belong to a long line of meditation masters. And if you haven't had this lineage, then you are not really part of the true elite. And of course, this made the emperor very angry because he liked Kumara Jiva. So for a while, he had Buddhabhadra exiled. Keep him out of the city, keep him from upsetting people by claiming that there were two ways to look at Buddhist meditation. Now, was Buddhabhadra a Mahayanist? He and Kumarajiva were at odds. He was saying that Buddhism is practice. It's yogic practice. Maybe not so much the philosophy. Well, in the 5th century, another person emerges from the mists of history. He's still very misty. Many stories about Bodhidharma. We don't really, it's very hard to piece together an accurate biography of him. He came to Guangzhou. He's identified as being South Indian. That would be a place, a jumping off point from India to go to Guangzhou in China by sea. He came by sea. And Bodhidharma came with a strong message that practice and meditation was at the very core of Buddhist practice. And therefore, the Mahayana, which developed in China, has primarily been following the Chan or meditation tradition that goes back and is identified with the Bodhidharma heritage. Certainly, Bodhidharma and this tradition coming in through Guangzhou spread north and spread throughout China and established that aspect of Chinese Buddhism, which we call Chan, which is Mahayana. It is the main Mahayana practice of East Asia, particularly China and Korea. If we return to India itself, the spread of Buddhism into Sri Lanka, which of course today is one of the great strongholds of the Theravada tradition. But Mahayana came to Sri Lanka. It came across, and as you can see, no big surprise that you can practically walk from India to Sri Lanka through the islands and the coral reefs. Not quite, but you can do a lot of it. So that Sri Lanka inherited a form of Buddhism that we know of as Tantra. And that tantric tradition of Mahayana that came to Sri Lanka and was established, as you can see on the map, at Anuradhapura, kind of the central highlands of Sri Lanka. That form was a very crucial development in Mahayana. The site of this reform was Abhayagiri Monastery in, and I like to show this picture with it in its dual aspect. It wasn't too long ago that this monastery obviously had fallen into disrepair. And the great stupa at Abhayagiri was covered with brush and had been overgrown. Today, it's all been cleared, repaired, and it's, I think, the second tallest stupa in Sri Lanka at that monastery. But at Abhayagiri, this was a crucial place for the spread of Mahayana, in that it was the place where, for example, when the Chinese sought to have women ordained as nuns, they came to this monastery and got monks from Abhayagiri, nuns, and took them to Guangzhou, and from there to Nanjing, the capital at that time, where they converted and ordained women as full monastic members. Now, later, this form of Mahayana in Sri Lanka and the form found at Abhayagiri was replaced. And Abhayagiri's stupa was left to decay. But at the time when it was happening, this tantric form of Mahayana was beginning to spread by sea across toward at least the islands of Southeast Asia, and it was also spread from there to Tibet. That was when the famous teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, Atisha, left his home in Bengal, traveled down the east coast of India, went to Sri Lanka. From there, he went to Palembang in Sumatra to be trained in Tantra. When he was trained in Tantra, his training said, first you master Prajnaparamita, and then you master the rituals of empowerment that are done through dharanis and mantras or recited spells. So Mahayana has had all kinds of appearances, and we need to identify each of those appearances. The largest Buddhist structure in the world is Borobudur. It's on the Southeast Asian island of Java. And Borobudur has Mahayana aspects in it. All along the terraces are carvings of narratives, and part of those narratives are Mahayana texts being translated from text into narrative art. It's, of course, one of the most magnificent monuments in the world, completely now restored. It had once been crumbled. What you see today, when the Dutch first arrived on Java, they heard hints about this place, and when they went through the jungle, they found this overgrown mound, and they began the process of uncovering what the mound was, stripping away all of the debris, just like we saw at Abhayagiri, and reconstructing what had once been there. The work went on until the 20th century, and you can see what a wonderful job they've done. They took all those thousands of stones and figured out exactly where they had once been, reinforced them, and put together reconstructed a Mahayana element in the history of Buddhism. So you have the Mahayana of Borobudur. That's the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the 10 Bhumis of a Bodhisattva. You have the idea of the body of the Buddha, the 3 bodies, maybe even the 4 bodies of Tantric Buddhism. And what was of amazement to the people who did all this is that the top stupa was always empty. There was no Buddha image in it. There was nothing in it. And people have struggled desperately to understand what that meant. So we have to look at a place like this and say there was Mahayana at Borobudur. So the Pala Empire in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries still covered the ancient area of the Ganges Basin, the old homeland of Buddhism. And while much of India had gone toward the Brahmanic tradition, the Pala held on to Buddhism longer than any other part in terms of major practice and support from the government. The people from the Pala practiced a form of Tantra. Undoubtedly, this is where it helped spread from there to places like Palembang and to Borobudur and beyond. So we need to understand that there is a Mahayana, which is early Tantra. That is Prajnaparamita plus these transformative and powerful new rituals of empowerment that were used by the practitioners. I mentioned Atisha. He went to Palembang, Sri Lanka. Then he returned to his old home in Bengal near Kolkata, as it's now called. And from there, worked his way through Nepal into Tibet and spent the rest of his life spreading his teaching of Tantra throughout Tibet. So you have the Mahayana of Tibet, an enormous development. I show you Potala here, and you can see the size of it. And the size of it is indicative of the fact that the Buddhist Mahayana in Tibet became a powerful tool, a powerful part of the life of the people of Tibet. So when you speak of Mahayana in Tibet, what aspect of it do you mean? Is it the Tantra? Is it the Dalai Lama? It has as many aspects as any other form of Mahayana. So we're always constantly trying to look at what happened to Mahayana. And I hope I've made the point that you can see how important it is when you say Mahayana to tell us which one, what aspect. In China, after Bodhidharma, a new development that was purely from within the Chinese culture, I would say. A Mahayana began to appear based on the teaching of famous Huineng, the 6th patriarch. And his message was that the central core of Buddhism is meditation. And he himself practiced it. It is said that he practiced in a cave, that meditation is best practiced in caves. They shelter you from the weather. They're cool in the summer. They're warm in the winter. And so he practiced what's called wall gazing. It's said that he just looked at the wall in front of him in the cave and meditated. From this has developed the largest Mahayana tradition in the world. That is the Chinese Chan tradition. And even today, this is still the most populated part of the Mahayana tradition in the world. A new work has been done in Hong Kong, which says that it wasn't that he was a wall, sat and stared at a wall. In fact, this research in Hong Kong suggests that that the word means that he sat on a wall and looked out across the world and meditated on the vision that he saw by sitting on the wall rather than sitting in front of the wall. But there's a very powerful tradition of Mahayana which says he stared at the wall. And this tradition has dominated East Asian Buddhism. Japanese is a development directly from Huineng. And you can see that the monks are sitting, staring at the wall. They are trying to replicate the work that was done by Bodhidharma and Huineng, who's just meditated, looking at the wall. Japanese Zen has been extraordinary in its aesthetic abilities. Those beautiful Zen gardens at Japanese monasteries, particularly in the city of an old capital of Kyoto, are just beyond belief. They are some of the most wonderful pieces of art ever developed in the world. And they are the product of the meditative state. And they are intended to remind us of Mahayana meditation, if you will. So we have Japanese Mahayana. However, when Buddhism started to be studied in the West, particularly in the US, Japanese Zen captured people's imagination, primarily through the works of D.T. Suzuki, who had written books in English about Japanese Zen. And so people reading D.T. Suzuki and the practices that were developed came to feel that Zen was a dominant Mahayana tradition in Japan. But it's not so. The Zen tradition is from Japan, has several forms: Renzai, Soto, Obaku. But it's a small, almost marginal tradition in terms of the overall numbers and the overall practice of Mahayana in Japan. As in China, Chan has always been equaled by another tradition, which is the Pure Land. Pure Land is one in which Amitabha Buddha and Kuan Yin dominate. This form of Buddhism says you may find that you can't get there through meditation. In fact, there was a whole tradition that grew up that said, we can't do it anymore. We can't have enlightenment through our meditation. What we have to do is to call upon Amitabha to give us the gift of enlightenment. And down in Guangzhou came the development of Avalokiteshvara, a bodhisattva of compassion, who was identified with the sea and therefore was amalgamated, was seen to be an avatara of the goddess of the sea. And so Pure Land developed this white goddess figure. She, like Virgin Mary in Christianity, complete compassion. Kuan Yin will help anybody, anytime, no matter how bad they are, no matter how they are lacking in anything. Those who call upon her, she has compassion and she responds. Powerful message. Powerful message. So we have Mahayana of the Pure Land, based on Amitabha or based on Guanyin. I would say today the dominant form of Mahayana among Chinese is tied to Guanyin. And so we finally come to global Buddhism, global Mahayana. There is a global Mahayana. And here's what it looks like. Here's a picture of the Buddhist Union meeting in Poland. People dressed in European clothing, informal, still carrying the artistic elements of Mahayana from Tibet and from China and East Asia. So we have a global Mahayana now. And you can find it in Poland and the US and in Chile, Australia. This is an example of how when we start to look at Mahayana, we start to look at Buddhism. I think we have to add some adjectives. Do you mean global Mahayana? And which type of global Mahayana? Is it based on Chinese, or is it based on Tibetan? Or is it based on Korean? Or Vietnamese? So we have this issue of how we identify Buddhism itself. Is it a single thing? Or is it a term which has to be qualified? And we have to say what we mean when we're talking about it. As people who are studying Buddhism, I think the answer is we must always qualify which one we're talking about. We must always be sure that we understand that we can look back at the roots and the history. But in every case, I think we need to understand what was our source, to know what our source, how our source was developed, to know where the text came from, if we can possibly find that out, what they taught, when were they put together, when did they become printed and published. So when we're studying Mahayana, we're studying Buddhism. And when we're studying Buddhism, we're studying something that has multiple aspects, multiple formations, multiple ways of being seen, multiple practices. And it's part of our very difficult task to make sure that we are clear about what part of it we speak of when we say these words: Buddhism, Mahayana. We must be very clear and precise. Thank you very much.